Perfect.
So, no, we were going to have Maddie on to discuss memory because I love the topic, and the more I learn about it, the crazier it kind of is.
It's real fun.
It's fun.
So
It's real fun.
Allow me to just set this up. Super broad strokes I'm going to paint in, just to set up the kinds of things that Megan's going to say. The reason why I find memory, I just need to check on my stuff. I find memory interesting and fun to learn about and teach about is because it's so contrary to what we think. These pork chops are going to be the death of me. Here's what I mean by that. A lot of people have a naive psychology notion that memory kind of works like a recording, that we just go back to a recording and, look at the thing that was put there perfectly. It's not how it works. It's more like we pick up on cues and then reconstruct the memory based on those very scant cues, and then we fill in the rest based on our expectations of things that like must have happened, based on previous experience and stuff like that. So that's what makes demonstrations like the word list game super fun, for those of you that don't know what the word list game is. And then I'll hand it off to you, Megan, after this. Word list game is like, word lists are very popular in memory research. If I were to dictate a list of words to you and asked you not to write them down, but to just listen, and then when I was done, write down as many as you can in order, I can make some predictions based on memory research about what's going to happen. One is, you'll probably remember the first word. That's the primacy effect. Another is, you'll probably remember the last word. That's the recency effect. Another is, if I designed the words to paint a picture about a word that isn't on the list, you likely have that word on your list. So if all my words had to do with music, but music wasn't one of those words, I can predict that a majority of people who take this kind of memory task are going to reconstruct their memory based on what must have been there. Oh, well, piano was in there, radio was in there, music had to have been in there, right? That's what makes memory so interesting. Another thing that these blind spots afford us are these things called hindsight bias. Now, here's where I hand it off to Megan, because she worked in a lab that specifically researched hindsight bias. So with that as your opening, tell us a little background, Megan.
Yeah, about hindsight bias as a concept.
Yeah, just unpack. Well, you know what? You started off by saying debiasing.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
Debiasing. So in the context that I'm looking at it, I work in a lab that's looking at metacognition and learning. So when I'm talking about debiasing, what we're looking at is techniques. So currently we're looking at a study that's trying to reduce overconfidence effects. So what we're doing is we're presenting people with a set of studies, and then we're asking them to think counterfactually. And so counterfactual thinking and mental simulation are sort of big topics in debiasing. And so these techniques are basically asking people to think of alternative outcomes. So you're presented with a scenario, how could it have turned out differently? And by asking people to think counterfactually, a few things can happen. First, if we're asking them to think of a plausible alternative, something that could likely happen, that usually decreases their confidence in a particular outcome. So the goal of all this, again, is to reduce hindsight bias,
I need for you to unpack why confidence is such an issue. Because in memory research, there's a couple of factors that work against us. And one is that we are overconfident. So is there any more you can add to that as to why you're looking at confidence as a variable?
Yeah, sure. So when we're talking about hindsight bias, I like to think of it as the I knew it all along phenomenon.
Mm-hmm.
You hear about something and then you say, oh yeah, I could have predicted that easily once you have the knowledge of a certain occurrence. So hindsight bias usually increases your confidence in estimation ability to predict particular outcomes, this whole realm. It makes you feel like you have knowledge that you likely don't have. And so when we're looking at confidence, a lot of the methods that we use to counteract hindsight bias are reducing people's confidence in the probability of an outcome. So when we present a study, instead of giving people the outcome up front, which they will immediately buy into, before presenting the results of a scenario, we would say, how do you think this could have turned out differently? Can you think of a plausible scenario where this might have turned out differently? And that reduces people's likelihood to be overconfident in their later estimations. So for an example, if I said there was a study conducted where we had musicians and non-musicians listen to music, and they had to recognize whether it was composed by a human or a computer. How do you think the study might have turned out? Great. They list a few possibilities. How could it have turned out otherwise? And if they're presenting ideas that they buy into, possible alternative outcomes, then we often see a reduction in confidence in the true outcome, which is good, because then when people are making later estimations or encountering novel scenarios, we can sort of reduce that hindsight bias and overconfidence. And this is particularly useful, I think, in education in the classroom when you're preparing students for a test, say, and you're saying, how do you think you're going to do? How might the situation go otherwise? What do you need to do in order to succeed? So it's also creating a bit of cognitive dissonance as well, and sort of recognizing the difference between the actions in the scenario and the outcome that's desired. So I think those all work together.
Yeah, that's. So I'm going to try to paraphrase what you said a little different. Obviously, I'm going to paraphrase it a little differently. So are you saying that so it sounds like you're saying confidence is a filter through which hindsight bias manifests. And if you could do something to tweak that filter, then the resulting effect won't be so hindsight biasy, or the hindsight bias that exists will be weaker. They'll be less confident in it, and therefore easier to recalibrate.
Yeah, I think that's a fair thing to talk about. So reducing confidence is one method to counteract hindsight bias. Okay. So our goal is potentially to stop people from engaging in hindsight bias in the future, to lessen the effects of it, that sort of thing. So I think, reducing confidence is one method to sort of counteract or combat hindsight bias.
Interesting.
Well, is one of the problems with hindsight bias that it increases confidence because you say to yourself, well, I've been correct so many times in the past, I must know what I'm talking about and be able to be correct in the future. So is this a chicken in the egg thing, or am I and is that one of the central problems with hindsight? My second question would be, I never ask simple questions. I ask like compound shit. So and then I guess the other question would be, what is that the biggest problem or the only problem with hindsight bias? What are the main reasons that we would want to get rid of it?
Yeah, so I think one area that people have looked at is that reducing hindsight bias improves people's estimation abilities, and it can be in novel categories. So you might present one scenario and use counterfactual thinking, mental simulation to reduce hindsight bias. I'm trying to thought. So you might, so you're gonna lost my little train there, but
what are some of the problems with hindsight bias? What are the biggest problems with it? And is it self-fulfilling? So do we have the confidence creates the hindsight bias, creates the confidence problem, that's sort of what it sounded like you were suggesting.
Yeah. I think causality is a bit hard to determine here. I'm trying to remember the train that I was on thinking.
Well, it sounded like you were talking about how if you hold them accountable to things that they know that they said before something happened, it reduces the hindsight bias. So like it sounds like, and this might not have been what you were referring to, but it sounds like the research that you do is almost like an intervention.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
It's an intervention, and because it's an intervention, you do see this as a problem. Otherwise, there's no reason to intervene.
Yeah.
And so, So like some general problems for hindsight bias would be like, take a step back and just kind of walk us through like why hindsight bias is such a bad thing.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think at least a benefit of reducing it, like I said, and sort of the train was improving people's estimation ability, which that can transfer to a lot of realms. So like, again, students performing well on a test or predicting an outcome in the future. If we can reduce their confidence to a level that's, aligns with where it should be, aligns with their actual ability, then there's benefits to that, right? So it's sort of like it's like Dunning-Kruger in a way, reducing confidence to the level it should actually be at, and sort of giving people a tool with which to assess and predict novel situations. So it could be in a trivia scenario, and you're making a prediction about any sort of novel outcome. It's useful for estimation ability.
All right. And it sounds like, so what you're saying too is that this would actually affect all sorts of things, especially since memory is so ubiquitous and we rely on it.
You can fit any concept into this. This is like an equation that you can fit any concept in, right? The confidence filter about any concept can manifest as hindsight bias. And to answer your question previously, I think I was going to riff off of the idea that what Megan's lab is researching is an intervention, and I think that recognizing, like having gone through this intervention, helps at least put a pause to that reflex, right? Because that's kind of what mindfulness is. This is almost like, I view it as mindfulness training, right? Like maybe you didn't know that you have this blind spot. Let's play this game. What do you think is going to happen? Write it down. Here's what happened. Does that match what you thought? Really? Because here's what you said that you thought. Oh man, isn't it weird how humans are playing to this? Just that revelation can take your system 1 thinking of being overconfident about wrongness and allow a system 2 process to be like, oh, last time I did that, I felt weird having it pointed out how bad I am at it. Let me think about this more. Let me be a little more system 2 instead of system 1. So I don't know if that exactly addresses what you're talking about, Nick. And by the way, I'm speculating like crazy, combining lots of different pieces of knowledge that I have. You know what I mean? So
I normally assume most of what you say is a guesstimate. I mean, but it actually almost sounds like like behaviorist, like you're almost like cognitively training yourself in almost a behaviorist manner to stop doing that kind of mental hiccup kind of thing.
That is you can use system 2 to hone system 1. Not perfectly. The best thing, this is a little bit of a rabbit hole. The best thing you can do that system 2 can do for you is to let you know which environments you're suckiest at and to steer you clear of those environments. Because the reflex is just so strong and difficult to catch in the moment. It's easier to just avoid moments where you're going to be prone to that.
Yeah, and I think it's a bit of a metacognitive judgment that way. It's sort of an ability to step back and have perspective about your own thought processes and your own likelihood to be overconfident or assume that you would have known information. So I think in that sense too, it comes from that framework.
Yes. So you use metacognition where I use mindfulness. To me, they are the same thing. One's the technical term, though.
Yeah.
So I've heard it said too that, and I don't know if this is true, I've just heard this said, that we actually tend to reconstruct our memories from the last time we remembered it. So an event occurs. We then, a couple months later, reflect back on that event. If months later we decide to reflect back on that event, we're actually reflecting back on our previous reflection of that event. So every time we remember something and we're actively trying to remember it, we're actually more remembering, because you remember more. You better remember more proximate memories anyway, right? The closer a memory is, the more likely you are to remember it accurately. So your brain is actually trying to remember what you remembered last time. Remember the process of remembering it, because it says, well, that's going to be more accurate than going all the way back and remembering. So each time you remember something, you're actually reconstructing the memory and changing it further and compounding the issue. Is that accurate? Or reasonably accurate, kind of?
My quick take on this would be, I don't know about the research that specifically talks about that, but it is undeniable that continuous repeated retellings of the same event influence your memory. How they influence your memory might be different per individual, the kind of memory, that kind of thing. But yeah, I mean, this is, and since I don't know, I'll leave it at that so that Megan can say it.
Yeah, I think it is important to note that you're getting a concept right, that when we access a memory again, there is a possibility that we're doing an overwrite, a rewrite of that memory. So it's, again, not a recording that you revisit consistently. It's like you're opening a file and you're making edits to it each time you revisit or access that memory. But I think an important thing with memory is how is emotional salience of a particular event. I think that's really important. And this plays out across age in some interesting ways too. We tend to remember intensely negative memories much more strongly than we remember intensely positive. But this also changes. This also changes with age. And so we've seen some research on what's called the positivity effect, which is that older adults will consciously remember, and it's intentional too. They will intentionally remember more positive information and more positive events, whereas younger adults tend to remember more negative information. And so that the emotional salience of it plays a big role in what memories we consolidate, and what really sticks with us.
And it makes sense that negative emotions, right? Just from a survival evolutionary perspective, right? Negative things, remembering negative things more than positive things has a survival value to it, right? If you wanted to, even if you just wanted to give yourself a just so evolution psychology story.
Right.
But go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think another important relationship in memory is knowing that the relationship between memory accuracy and memory confidence is usually not a linear and positive one. That just because someone's super confident in their memory, especially when this comes to flashbulb memories, which we can talk about, that relationship is not always directly related.
That's hilarious. Like that's my favorite area of social psychology.
Yes.
It's the areas of biases. It's the predictably irrational heuristics that we go through, and they're actually like mental gymnastics that we don't even realize that we're doing. But it's a very elaborate routine that leads us to horrible conclusions.
Yes, anyway. And I think of this in terms of someone sitting in a courtroom, and there's a trial going on, and a woman's on the stand and points to someone and says, "That's the man that killed my son." And they say, "How confident are you?" And she says, 100%. That does not mean she's 100% accurate in identifying that person. Yes. And that's an important thing. But that statement has a powerful effect, and we put so much value on eyewitness memory. And the reliability isn't there.
We're going to get into the Loftus material now.
Yeah, well, and I forget the name of the case, and it's a famous one, and I've forgotten. I just got to try to memorize it because I always call on it. Which was the woman? There was a woman who had been raped, and they gave her she pointed at somebody out of a mugshot, did a lineup, identified the same guy, and she was dead sure it was this guy. She remembers it being this guy. He went to jail for, I think it was 20 years. He was exonerated by DNA evidence. They found the correct person, looks completely different, same race, but other than that, very different human being. And she still remembers it as this guy. She can't actually change the memory, but she and this guy now go on tour together, and they go talking to universities. They go talking. They did Oprah, and they were talking, and Oprah even asked her, she goes, "Do you still remember it as this guy?" She goes, "Yeah," and he's a friend, and I have to try to, and it's just sort of like, that's still the guy she sees, but she knows for a fact she's wrong.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. And we can talk about the sort of the practices of law enforcement and, and interviewing witnesses. There's so much research on cognitive interviews and
Oh, yeah.
techniques to try and reduce the consolidation of misinformation or introduction of misinformation. There's so much there.
Well, so maybe this isn't the appropriate time. Maybe we can get you back, Megan, to just talk about, to sit back from like the super technical language and then engage in the thought experiment. If we were to do away with eyewitness testimony and have a more reliable, objective measure in place for that, what would that justice system look like, right? We could riff on that for at least an hour, don't you think?
Yeah. Yeah.
So let's put a pin in that for a future discussion.
Yeah, that's what I think about.
Mm-hmm.
So, the only I know this is now you've been in his house, right? You know him like because this is the one where I will send you a cattle prod and it's going to have voltage and we just got to, and you got to get it to Shanna and it's the voltage isn't the key, it's the amperage, and I will get it to you, and if you can get it to her, and just every time he says rabbit hole or pin in it, we just and it'll be perfect.
Hot second, bumper sticker. These are the Moudyisms. Pivot, nuance, sophistication.
Speaking of rabbit holes,
mindfulness.